Hey all, so today we're going to about evaluating research and drawing conclusions. Now, so up to this point, we've talked more about the design of research, the purposes of research, everything up into um, what do you do with this information you've just gotten. And a major part of evaluating research, especially within IB psychology, comes into play when you're thinking about critical thinking. In both types of essays, but especially the ERQ or extended response question, this is going to be a major part of what you're going to have to do. And a lot of the marks that you receive come down to how you evaluate research, right? How are you thinking about the strengths and the limitations of the research and how the researcher carried out the experiment, carried out the research, carried out the analysis of that research. And so we're going to be looking at some of these different ways or some of these different factors that you can evaluate research along. So the first factor that we're going to look at here is reliability. So this is the consistency of a study in terms of the extent to which a test or measure produces the same results in repeated trials. So as a test of intelligence, for example, or of scholastic aptitude, sometimes we use the SAT test, right? A measure of reliability for that test would be that you are getting somewhat consistent scores uh, throughout the times that you're taking it, right? And this is controlling for other factors like how long you've studied, um, how many times you've taken the test, all of those sorts of things. But reliability would really be about that, okay? So if you had the test, you would expect someone to get somewhat similar scores. You wouldn't go from a 900 to a 1400 to a 1200. You know, that would sort of show test scores that are all over the board, and you couldn't get a real consistent view of what the person can do. And so reliability is important for that way. When you're looking at psychological research, and if you're seeing that a lot of the trials are all over the board in terms of what the subject did or what the phenomena being studied was measured at, that may be a lack of reliability in the study. If other studies are not able to, uh, replicate the results of this, that may be a problem of reliability in the test and may call into question um, how much of a causal relationship or even a correlated relationship there is between these two phenomena that you're studying. The next one, which is extremely, extremely important to know, is the idea of validity. And validity is the degree to which the results accurately reflect what the research is measuring. Even though it says two forms up there, as you can see, there's several forms. The two main ones are external validity and internal validity. But I do want you to know the other three as well, as they will help deepen your knowledge of validity. So really, validity is a measure of alignment, okay? As it says up there, how much do the results accurately reflect what the research is measuring? So the first form here is external validity, the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized or transferred to another sample or context. Right? If you are in an experiment, especially like a lab experiment, there may be issues with external validity or ecological validity um, because there are um, different strains or different contextual factors that make it more likely that you get the results that you do in a lab than in a real life situation. Maybe the artificial nature of the lab makes it so that you would never get those results again outside of that. And so what you would say is that there is a low external validity in this context. Since psychologists are very interested in finding things out about the real world, this would of course be an issue. If you can only do this in a lab, and if it's not being brought out to the real life or to real world situations, that would be an extreme issue. The next one is internal validity, the extent to which a study establishes a true cause and effect relationship between a treatment and an outcome and considers all possible confounding explanations. If you had a test where there's different factors which may have caused this correlation to take place, there may be calls into question about internal validity, because you're not proving that one thing caused the other to happen. Right? If you had a set of dominoes that were set up and were pushed over, but you had never actually touched the domino before they started falling, you could call into question the internal validity of you pushing that domino over. Maybe there were confounding factors like wind, maybe your dog came in and accidentally wagged its tail and knocked the dominoes over. Okay? Those types of things would call into question the internal validity of your test. The next one is face validity. And like it says there, it's the least scientific one, because really all you're doing is seeing how valid your results seem based on what they look like, right? And so you're just sort of, spotting it and looking at it and saying, yeah, that looks good. Yeah, that's aligned. Yeah, that's, actually a true cause and effect relationship. Yeah, those are valid results. But it's not actually scientifically testing that. And so for that reason, it's the least scientific. The next one, construct validity, the extent to which your research measures the construct. And when we talk about constructs, these are the psychological phenomena of study. So an example of a construct is intelligence, right? So if you are looking at the construct validity of, a study on intelligence, you're going to want to look at the extent to which the test that you use to measure intelligence actually is a measure of intelligence and is not a measure of memory, is not a measure of attention, is not a measure of something else. The last one we're going to talk about today, and we are going to talk about another one in addition to this one, ecological validity at a different date. But content validity, whether the measure used in the research covers all the content in the underlying construct. Right? This is the thing that you are trying to measure once again. So with content validity, are we missing certain factors that make up a part of, and we'll use our last example of intelligence, are we missing certain parts of intelligence within this measure? Is it actually covering all of what intelligence encompasses, or is it only covering a part of what it encompasses? Those sorts of things with content validity. I'll say this, you might not be referring to content validity all the time. It's much more likely that construct validity, internal validity, external validity, ecological validity, in which the environment of the experiment could be called into question, or you are looking at the environment of the experiment and whether those results can be generalized to other factors. Those things are going to probably pop up more for you as you're looking at critical thinking for these things. All right, the next one here is credibility. Right? And this is a term only used in qualitative research, so only used in research where there are non-numerical data sets. So this is to indicate whether or not the findings of the study are congruent with the participants' perceptions and experiences. And this is quite important because, if the researcher has drawn conclusions that vary wildly from what the person would perceive to have happened and the experiences of that person, then there may be low credibility within this particular study. And that leads us, this issue of credibility may lead us into issues of bias as well. Okay, factors that may affect or skew the results of the study. And there's three real common biases that we're going to talk about here. The first one is researcher bias, when the researcher acts differently towards participants, which may influence or alter the participants' behavior. So in qualitative research, the researcher must assess personal biases in relation to the study. Okay? And they must apply what is called reflexivity to control for this. And so what this means is that, if you are biased towards a certain gender, race, etc., if you are looking for certain results as the researcher, and you treat the person in the one condition differently from other subjects, then that may be a problem, and that may skew the results. The next one are participant bias, and this can also be called demand characteristics. So when participants act according to how the researcher may want them to act. And this comes into play sometimes either when the researcher pays people to do studies, or when the participants themselves have done a bunch of different psychological studies and they start to realize and look for beats, so to speak, that they can sort of look at and they identify as being a part of a psychological study. The last one is sampling bias. So this occurs when the sample is not representative of the target population, whether the sample is based on selection criteria or probability sampling. So if you were looking at a nationwide survey of women, but you only chose women from the state of Florida, that may not be indicative of the entire population of women across the country. And so there would be sampling bias within that, because you have not sort of chosen an equal sample throughout the country who may be worried about different things, may have different cultural values, may have different experiences and ideas about how the world works. All of these things would skew your research, and so that's important for those reasons. And so once you sort of looked at how and evaluated how the research was set up, you're going to go into how you draw conclusions from the data that they received. And there's a few different principles that sort of allow someone to draw conclusions. And we'll talk about them in the next several slides. We've talked about correlation and causation on some small fronts, but they are important for how you draw conclusions. Replication, generalization, transferability, and triangulation. So the first one of these, and most important in a lot of ways, is correlation and causation. And this is incredibly important terms to know because they really set up what we draw from research. Correlation, the connection between two or more things, and causation, the action of causing something. Okay? And oftentimes there can be a confusion between what is a correlated set of things and what is actually causation. The more the stronger relationship between two things is causation. Okay, you have caused an effect on something else. You have caused something else to happen. If you have correlation, there could be a connection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the one thing caused the other thing to happen. Two things could change at the same time through mere coincidence and show correlation, but not actually cause each other to happen. And so oftentimes the stronger scientific research finds itself with the ability to show causation. And there's a few thinking biases that you're really going to have to make sure that there's actual causation here. You're going to have to control for other factors. You're going to have to control for other things that are happening. And so there's this false equivalency of correlated data indicating causation, which may happen. There's a few things like illusory correlation and causation correlation fallacy, where you believe that two correlated things may actually be causing something to happen. Okay? So let's say that two people got in an accident, right? And you were friends with both of these people. You may think that one person caused the other to happen, but they could have just as easily been in two separate accidents around the same time as each other, and that would not show causation. So this idea of causation and correlation is quite important to sort of nail down. You don't want to sort of be taking a correlated connection and thinking that it's a causation. The next one is replication. Right? So the degree to which the study can be repeated by the same or different researchers and achieve comparable results. And we talked about reliability earlier, and this is, a somewhat connected thing, even though it's not the same thing. Right? Could you do another study and achieve similar results? And that's something that you're really going to have to look at as a researcher or an evaluator of research and see whether you could do that again. Because obviously, if you're looking at something and saying that this is a principle of how behavior is studied, you're going to want to make sure that it can be replicated over and over again, that it is actually not just the product of a biased, skewed, wrongly created experiment. The next one is generalization and transferability, and in some ways they're very similar, but they're used in different types of research. So generalization is used in quantitative research, and it is based on probability sampling, and the results are applicable to the whole target population. You could generalize this numerically for different populations. Transferability, used in qualitative research. Could you transfer these results from these, survey, from this, for example, survey experiment or survey research, and transfer it to different settings, populations outside the study? And this is only done if they are corroborated by findings of similar studies. Okay? So if multiple case studies have been taken and have found similar results, that could show transferability as well. So the last term that we're going to talk about today is this idea of triangulation, which is something that you may not have heard before, but I think once you sort of think about it, it makes a lot of sense, and you probably have worked with it in the past. So this is an approach to ensure that there's enough evidence available to make a valid claim about the results of a study. One of the main ways that this happens in psychological research is to use methodological triangulation. And when we talk about triangulation, really all we're saying is that we're finding multiple sources of information or evidence to sort of back up our claim. So with methodological triangulation, this is where you test a theory or a psychological phenomenon using different methods of inquiry. So you may not just rely on a lab experiment, but you may have a survey, an interview, a case study, all within the same experiment to sort of back up what you are saying about this particular phenomena. In your own life, you may have used this with like research papers. If you're writing a research paper, you wouldn't just have one source of information. You wouldn't just use one book, because that information may be skewed, biased, whatever. If you keep seeing the same information in book after book after book, it's more likely that this may be true, or at least you can prove that it's false in some way by finding other information. So triangulation becomes quite important in terms of deepening the science and showing just how exactly the scientist found many sources of information from the study. All right, with that being said, like I said earlier, This information and these terms are going to become very, very important as we go through this year. We're going to be using this a lot, especially when critically thinking about research. And that's one of the main tenets of this course, is to get a sense of how to think about psychological research so you can be a more discerning reader of psychological research and a more discerning thinker about behavior. So with that being said, please let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for listening. Have a great day.